Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. Joining me now is Freeman Dyson. Mr. Dyson, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Man-made climate change. Where are we at from your perspective? Is it incontrovertible science, or are we being led down a path that you are suspicious of?
Well, first of all, there is man-made climate change. I mean, it's a question how much and is it good or bad? And there are all sorts of questions. The fact that it exists is not a question. Certainly there is some effect of humans on climate, and we have to try to find out what it is. All I would say is, first of all, we don't understand the details. It's probably much less than is generally claimed. And the most important thing is that there are huge non-climate effects of carbon dioxide which are overwhelmingly favorable, which are not taken into account. To me, that's the main issue, that the Earth is actually growing greener. This has been actually measured from satellites. The whole Earth is growing greener as a result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's increasing agricultural yields, it's increasing the forests, it's increasing all kinds of growth in the biological world. And that's more important and more certain than the effects on climate.
Well, this is where you started your research, isn't it? The effects of CO2 on vegetation.
Yes.
And over the years, what have you found?
Well, it's increasing just more or less as we expected. I started working on this 37 years ago, and at the time when we thought the effects were maybe about 10%, and now it's probably more like 25% after 35 years. It's essentially what we expected. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up by 40% in that time, or something like that.
Yeah, up to about 400 parts per million at the moment. Just shy of that, I think.
Yes, about half of that is gone into raising vegetation. So vegetation has increased on the average by around 20%. And that's observed. And of course, it's extremely important. It actually is enormously beneficial both to food production and also to the biodiversity, preservation of species and everything else that's good. On the average, I mean, of course, it's not true everywhere, and you can find cases where it doesn't work and cases where it does work. If you look at the details, it depends on what other nutrients are available. Of course, if the growth of plants is limited by not having enough nitrogen, then giving it more carbon won't help. And so most of the time there is enough nitrogen, and giving it more carbon does help. So it's understandable that the effects vary from place to place.
You're also on record as saying that we will be able to genetically re-engineer trees to help absorb any excess amount of carbon that's in the environment. And I was reading recently about precision genetic engineering, so that we can splice right into the gene and say, this is the particular component. Do you see this being like an alternative if we get to the point where we go, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is something that we're uncomfortable with?
Yes, but that's in the very long run. And so I think people have to understand there are some things which are true right now, other things which will be true in 100 years, and other things which will be true in 500 years, and that makes a big difference. So what you're talking about, so genetic engineering of the plants all over the earth, I would say it probably at least 100 years from now. It certainly will be important in the long run, but it's a very long run. So one shouldn't think of that as something we're going to be doing in the next 10 years. I don't try to impute motives to people. I mean, I disagree with people very strongly, but I don't say that they're evil because they disagree with me. So I'm not talking about, I think I don't want to analyze other people's motives. There certainly is an enormous religion in which there are lots of true believers who think that climate change is evil and that we're going to run into big catastrophes if we don't do something drastic. And that's a sort of a belief system which exists. I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to understand their motives. I've always been fighting against the idea that the models actually are good predictors. And my friend Yuichiro Minabe, he's a Japanese climate expert who lives here in Princeton, and he was actually the first person who ever did climate models with increased carbon dioxide just to see what it would do. And he found the warming, and it was less than is now fashionable, but anyway, there was some warming.
Is this the modeling that goes back to the late 60s?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I was reading about that.
So anyway, Manabe always said, and still he says, that these climate models are excellent tools for understanding climate, but they're very bad tools for predicting climate. There's a whole lot of things they leave out, and that's why they're no good for prediction. That the real world is far more complicated than the models.
Because climate is too complex?
Yes.
And there's too many factors at work?
Yes, and you just cannot model everything. It's way out of sight. That this activity of the sun is having an effect. And of course there was a big additional piece of evidence, which was the little ice age which happened in the 17th century, which also coincided with the time when the sun went to sleep for about 70 years. There was a thing called the Maunder minimum, when the sunspots just didn't happen. And at the same time, there was a very cold climate in Europe. So that's fairly strong evidence of correlation. But there's much more direct evidence now from modern observations, so that the correlation is certainly there. Exactly how the activity of the sun influences the climate is not completely clear. It has something to do with cosmic rays, but it's not direct heating of the atmosphere. It's probably an effect on clouds, but we don't know for sure.
What led me on my path to try and understand where the truth was, I watched Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth.
Yes.
And in that movie, he says, when you take water vapor out of the equation, CO2 makes up about 30% of the Earth's greenhouse gases.
That's
and
true.
so I decided to, yeah, it is true, isn't it? Because I started to look at that statement and I went, okay, well, how much does, and that led me to ask, how much does water vapor, like what role is it? And back came this astounding number of 90%.
Yes.
And I went, well, how can you take water vapor out of the equation?
You can't.
And
I mean, it's all right if you want to talk about Mars. That's what makes it special. It is human activity. The fact is that CO2 is so beneficial in other ways. It would be crazy to try to reduce it. But if you talk to Chinese and Indians and people from Asia generally, they don't feel pessimistic at all. I mean, generally speaking, those countries in particular, things have improved so much in the last 50 years that they see continued improvement. So that this sort of mood of doom and gloom is, I would say, only particularly in the academic communities and particularly in the Western societies. So I don't think it's at all universal. It happens that the media have gone along with it, but I think that the general public has a lot more common sense.